This is panel number 3 of the day, Catalysts and Creativity. And we've got presentations from David, Jarrad and Chris. What I'll ask you to do is we'll be kicking off with David. So if you would like to share your screen, camera and audio, introduce yourself and then happily jump straight into your presentation.
Okay, we all good?
Fantastic.
Awesome. All right, so what I'm going to be talking about today then is the Games Jam as a catalyst for games design education. Now, a good chunk of the start of this presentation is explaining what that is for people who may not have known, but I am very aware that a good chunk of the people in this chat are from games. So just come with me on this journey, guys. You know, play along and we'll get through it together. So to start off with, who am I? My name's David James and I'm a senior lecturer in games technical design. And what I'm talking about today is a bit about that, but mainly about this research journey that I'm on. Okay, so as well as teaching, I'm also studying on a PhD, and I've recently had a change of direction, and I've got about 3 years to work on this bit of research from this point on, give or take. Okay, but I'm very much at the start of this particular new direction for what I'm doing. There's still an awful lot to go, but what I wanted to do today is just sort of share the initial ideas, the work that I've done so far, and we'll just sort of see how it goes and get a bit of feedback as well from people who are here. That'd be nice. And then in 3 years' time, assuming all goes well, there you go. That'll be me. Absolutely loving it. But we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. So what do I do? And again, I appreciate some colleagues will be in the exact same boat as me as this. So, you know, you can sort of chime in as well, I guess, in the chat. But I'm a technical designer. And what that means is I design experiences. So I'll talk about the design part first, because in games are all about experiences. I always tell the students, you know, we are in the business of experiences. And with games, it's normally like we want to give them a fun experience, we want those games to be fun to play. But, you know, we can do other things with games. We can make people feel scared, you know, we can make people laugh, we can make people feel sad, make people feel powerful, vulnerable. And we can also challenge, you know, a lot of things with games, a lot of sort of opinions and viewpoints, you know, just like film, literature, theatre. It's a creative thing where we express, you know, our ideas to an audience and they interpret them. And that's what design is about. We have the added complexity with games of there's that input element. You know, we have to create and design the inputs. Games have to feel good to play. Otherwise someone will switch off. So that's part of my role. Okay. The other one is the actual implementation of that stuff, you know, the actual implementation. So like you have to, or I have to have that technical ability to make those designs. And that's using scripting, you know, programming to actually make those designs and test them. So that's what I do. What about the students? So I've represented the students here with these, with these 4 things, these 4 little cube people, purely because that was easy to draw. So for no other reason. And I do want to point out these are legally distinct from minions for what it's worth as well. Legally distinct. I've used this to represent the students, right? If I was going to be more accurate with what our student base looks like, it'd be something a bit more like that. We have the nice problem in games of we have a bunch of students. We have a bunch, you know, people are interested, as you might imagine, in games. And what that means is we have to reflect on how we teach and we have to be innovative with what we do. I mean, I run a module at the minute. It's got 250 plus students on it in the first year. So we have to be innovative. And I mean, everyone, not just games, has been innovative over the last few years. We've had to be with like COVID, teaching online, transitioning back from online to in person and sort of having to deal with the problems of students being online for 2 years and, you know, and their motivations. There's been challenges, but what I hope is even just a little bit part of this research, by the time I'm done, will address some of that, at least help it a bit, he says, optimistically. I'll stick with these 4 drawings though, because it was easier to do instead of drawing a million on every single slide. What do we teach them then? So on games design, on that like our flagship games design course, we teach them that design that I talked about, that experience creation. We also teach them art. And games art in itself, you know, has got a particular set of challenges. So we're talking 2D and 3D art, but it's art that's built for games, you know, so it has to be efficient. It has to be well made so that it can perform well when we come to actually play these things. I have very little to do with the art side of things, as you've probably figured out thus far. That's done by our brilliant art team. Those guys, I don't see much of the art students for their own benefit. What I do get involved in a bit as well is the tech, though. So I'll see the tech side of things and I'll do the scripting with them. What we find, right, is we show students all of this in the first year, and they will tend to have like a bit of a preference for one of these things, and that's either because they're good at it, they enjoy it, or as we often find, those are one and the same. So someone might prefer design, someone might prefer art, someone might prefer scripting, tech. The interesting thing is, even though they've got that preference and that skill set in one of those areas, they've got an appreciation because we've shown them for all the others, So they might not be any good at art, but as a designer, they will have an appreciation for what is involved in it. And also an artist will have an appreciation for what the tech people need to do with their art assets that they're creating. So there's this relationship between all three. There is one last student I've left on the slide, and these are few and far between, but I wanted to allocate them anyway. These are the lesser spotted students who are just good at everything. They're just good at everything, almost in spite of us. With these, sometimes the best thing we can do is stay out of the way and not ruin them. I've called these the transcended beings of pure energy. They are just brilliant designers, they're brilliant at art, and they're brilliant at tech. They can just do it all. Whilst we love when they come along and we cultivate them as best we can, what we normally find is there is this preference for one of these disciplines. And that's important because that is echoed with what they do when they leave us. So when they graduate and they go on the merry way and they inevitably go into the games industry will be looking for that preference. They will be looking for skilled roles, but with an appreciation for the other areas. They will be looking for people who are artists but have got an appreciation for tech, design, with an appreciation for art, and so on and so forth. And that's what those roles are advertised as. I've mentioned two things there, and I'm just going to expand on that. I've mentioned academia then, us, and I've mentioned the games industry. These form the wider games community, and they kind of form it also with a third thing, which I'll touch on in a minute. But the academic community is part of the games community. What we do, we teach people how to make games. We teach people why they should make games. And we also sort of have, research about the impact of games on society. That's our sort of role in this. Industry then. Industry is obviously booming. I say obviously, if you're not from games, you wouldn't know that, but it is growing. It grows year upon year. It's a massive, massive industry with lots of jobs. Even if you're not into games, you will know of certain game titles, just like some films that you may never watch, like a summer blockbuster. It is massively growing. Third one I wanted to sort of bring into this then is that online hobbyist community. Essentially, these are the people who play those games but don't work in the industry, and that is most of them. And what they'll form is like communities around passion for playing these games, subreddits or subforums, just about people talking about how much they love these damn things, or sharing strategies, guides, whatever. The other part of that is the hobbyists, and these are the people who make stuff, but they don't do it professionally. They do it for the joy of making stuff. They don't have to teach it. They don't have to get paid to do it in the industry. They just enjoy the process of making it outside of their normal 9 to 5. The awesome thing about these three parts is, and I've called this the games community, as kind of just a catch-all. And the awesome thing about the games community is all these three different parts are in constant communication with each other. We in academia are always talking to to the industry to find out what their needs are, so we make sure our students match them. The industry talks to us about training, about reskilling, about preparing people for the future and helping with that. And then you've got the hobbyist online community, who talks to both. And you only have to go on Twitter to sort of see people from the industry interacting with hobbyists or people from academia, giving feedback, sharing guides. It's a vibrant, creative space, and there's loads of activities that stem from the games community throughout the year, which brings me a little circuitously, but I got there in the end, to my point, or to what I want to talk about on the rest of my talk. And that is one such event that happens in the games community. And that's the Games Jam. So very briefly, what is a Games Jam? They're creative events, right? They happen in the games community, but they also happen in other communities. There's lots of different type of jams. And essentially, someone will organize something. A bunch of people will get together and form little teams, and they will be given a very finite amount of time to create something. And that creation will often have some constraints tied to it. So, I'll talk about games in a second, but in other industries, with writing, we see writing jams where somebody will just say, right, this is the first line of a story, go out, everyone write the rest of it. And people do. And the way that they interpret that is fascinating. In games jams, though, and we've got Anna Kaiser called team who summarizes this and puts it far more eloquently than I just did. They say a games jam is an accelerated, opportunistic game creation event where a game is created in a relatively short time frame, exploring given design constraints, and end results are shared publicly. There you go. That's nice and succinct, isn't it? But yeah, that's essentially what it's about. Small teams working on a product over a short period of time with some constraints. Just give you a couple of examples. We ran one at Staff's last year. We called it Staff's Jam in 2021. It was at the start of this academic year, actually, so back in September. It involved just level 3 and 4 students, okay? And there was 40 of them. They made 6 teams, and we got 6 games out of them. Over 3 weeks this lasted. And the games were great. These were level 3 and 4 students. The fact that they got involved and made stuff on its own was fantastic. You don't expect the earth with these things. It is for the love of doing it, and it's just awesome to see. But what about, they go up in wider scales. So that's Staff's Jam that we ran just locally inside the university. What about the Global Games Jam? This is one that ran around the world, as its name would suggest. Let's just call it 29,000 people got involved in it from 104 countries, and they made over 6,000 games in 4 days. That is a hyper burst of creativity in a very short amount of time, with people creating this awesome stuff, around the world. And these things don't just run once. Well, the Global Games Jam runs annually, but there's other Global Games Jam events which happen. They happen throughout the calendar year. Just to touch on this idea of constraints that I mentioned, because it's important. So jams are all about working within constraints. You're often given a loosely defined sort of set of criteria. Some that we've seen in the past are technical, such as, you've got to make a game that uses one button. And that's limiting, when you know that like a controller's got a bunch and a keyboard's got a bunch more. So making something that just uses one button is a design challenge, and people get creative in how they interpret it. A game that lasts 10 seconds, so again, a very finite amount of time for the player, or something that exists just on one screen. Like, these are all limitations that you might not normally find in a finished commercial game, but it's creative and it gets people thinking. And that's that's the essence of it. These limitations aren't always technical as well. They are we're talking sort of thematic. So when in global games jams in the past, we've had things such as lost and found. Interpret it however you want. Just make sure that it's incorporated in some way in your game. What home means to you, and more recently, you are the monster. And the different ways that people interpreted that in their games was awesome. Really cool to see. So why am I looking at them? Well, apart from the fact that they're popular, and apart from the fact that they are a staple of the community, I think there's more. I think there's some benefits that we can get out of these. Start off, Piaget says that you learn through applied activities, or in other words, we learn by doing. And there is an awful lot of doing to be done in a games jam. There's small teams. You often have a lot to do, because in a big industry team, different people will be able to focus on one area for as long as they need to get it done. In a games jam, you've got a short amount of time, and it's a small team, so you might have to wear several different hats to get something working. You might be jumping from design, tech, art, just to help out. And that concentrated period of doing is very much going to improve whatever you're doing in that time, So I think it's a safe hypothesis to make that if you get involved in a games jam, it's going to improve your ability to use that, whatever you're doing. It's going to hone your skill. Next up, teaching is learning, I've called it. I think that when you have someone in a games jam environment, you put a load of people together or in small teams without members of academic staff, without team leaders from industry, what you're going to get is people helping each other, turning to each other for advice. And, we as academics, we know that nothing puts the fear of God in you like having to sort of learn something new and teach it. We break it down, we internalize it. And in having to teach it, we learn it brilliantly. And I think elements of this are going to crop up in games jams. I think they do, where people will explain different things to each other, and they will internalize it, and in explaining it, they will master it more themselves. I think that, again, is a simple hypothesis for me to sort of have on here. Makes you better at what you do through peer teaching. There's one more I just wanted to touch on. And it's the fact that games jams are, as they stand at the minute, are completely optional. There's no sort of real monetary prize for winning. When we've run them, we don't stick module credits on it. They get involved entirely of their own volition. Now, I think that's interesting, because what you can probably assume from that then is that, like, the people who get involved in games jams have a certain degree of self-motivation and self-actualization. And that's important. So I've touched on 3 things there. There's more that I'm going to cover overall, but there's the idea of you will get better if you get involved in a games jam, and you will have high motivation if you get involved. Leads me to sort of this rough kind of idea that games jams are good for you. If that's the case, if games jams are good for you, how do we get more people involved in them? And that's the second part of my research and what I'll be looking at further down the line. The first thing I want to find out is what their perception of them is. So why do people get or not get involved in jams? And that's going to be a case of simply asking students. And I expect there will be a lot of answers, coming back along the lines of perhaps, what if I'm not good enough? I don't know enough to get involved. But we know for a fact that level 3 and 4 students have been involved in games jams. So that isn't an issue. It's not about being good enough. It's about that creative process of making something. Or somebody, if they came back and said, I don't have time for this, is there anything we can learn that we can address with people, who don't feel they don't have time outside of their normal 9 to 5 to actually be involved in a games jam? What about, I don't have the resources? Somebody says they don't have a good enough PC at home to actually make stuff and be involved. Is there anything that we can explore there to give people access to the things that they need to get involved? And finally, more of a case of marketing, perhaps. Heck, as a games jam, there may be people who would love to be involved, they just didn't know they were there. So maybe some work can be done along getting people actually involved and working on these things. Next part then. What I also want to look at is the actual community and the makeup of that community. And I want to look at it real close and see who these people are who get involved and who doesn't get involved. Okay, because I think if we want to try and widen participation to it and get more people involved in game jams for the benefit, I want to look at it in 2 kind of broad areas, and there'll be more to this further down the line. But I'm interested in privatainment, not just for my research. I've been looking at it anyway in my teaching at level 4, looking at what people have come to my modules with from GCSE and college, and sort of making sure that we're matching that and we're not letting anyone down, indeed bringing people up. So that's something I'm interested in anyway, and I think it'd be interesting to see what privatainment looks like when it comes to games jam engagement. And also, on that trend, socioeconomic background. So people who, from different household incomes, ethnicity, even gender, I suppose, as well. We'll tie all of that in and look at the involvement. What can we do to sort of get more people involved from different socioeconomic backgrounds and demographics? That is kind of the aim of all this then. I want to identify the benefits of jams. I want to identify people's perceptions. I want to identify the demographics of the people who get and don't get involved, and what these barriers are that stop people getting involved. Because I feel if we can address that, if we can get more people involved in these things, we're going to end up with more self-motivated, confident, and hopefully capable students. The absolute last thing, which is for the right at the end, when I'm at the end of this particular journey, is to take what we can learn from jams and apply it back to teaching, apply it back to pedagogy. What innovations can we take from people's participation? Because I think it's going to take more than just whacking some module credits on a games jam and be like, there you go, do a games jam, get credits. Because then, you're almost nullifying that idea of self-motivation, that self-actualization, and doing it for the love of doing it. But there may be other things we can learn about self-motivation, about peer teaching, that may help us to alleviate some of these massive numbers. And also the idea of creativity and constraints. Assessments are creativity with constraints a lot of the time, but the idea of a games jam where people can interpret it in different ways, maybe there's something we can look at and learn there when it comes to the way that we assess. That brings me inevitably towards the last slide. So that's me, that's the talk. So lots for me to look into, lots for me to learn, but thank you for your patience.
Fantastic. So let me mute myself so it doesn't get loads of feedback back to me. The first question I've got is, a games jam for for my discipline in film, it's very similar to the idea of a 48-hour film challenge. You bring people together into teams. They come up with a concept, they film it, they edit it. It's a released product by the end of the 48 hours. So with the first question I've got is, obviously for film, it would be that the end product is obviously the film, but also potentially a screening. How are these games then, as you've mentioned, like given to public or wider audiences for them to play after a jam?
So places like Global Games Jam, take for example, it's got its own website, it's its own kind of outfit, and like they're all hosted, and you can they're all linked and listed there. And what people do, the whole point of Global Games Jam is people go and vote for the ones that they like, they play, they leave feedback, which is perhaps the most important part. You leave comments, and that's something for someone to reflect on. So you can just download them from links on the Global Games Jam website and play them there, and that's how you get to sort of see everybody's, and that's how that community keeps that that conversation about those games going.
Fantastic. And then I'm leeching a little bit of Sharon's question there as well.
No, cool.
And I guess it's this idea of the fear of taking part because of this fear of failing, or the game not working, or the film not being good enough, or the end product not being good. How do you encourage students to find that importance in the process over the end product?
That's exactly what I need to be investigating, and I think it's that's going to be one of the barriers. And if I just sort of, that is literally if I jump, that's this guy, this one. That's what if I'm not good enough, essentially, the fear of getting involved for failing. But I think what it might be is, with all four of these, well, especially the first and the last one, the yellow and the green person, it's about making people aware of what they are. It's not something that you join to win. It's something that you join to get involved with, to be creative. Nobody is going to make something that is brilliant in 2, 3, 4 days. Very rarely, unless you've got a particular sort of super skilled team coming together. So what I think you can help to alleviate that is show people other people's games from games jams. Show what people have, and even perhaps show the winning games, because that might lower people's expectations. It's like, oh, this one Global Games Jam, it's not going to set the world on fire, but I think it is about that, perhaps letting people see what these are actually involved. They're not competitions, they're not competitions, even though like there is votes in Global Games Jam. In many games jams, there's no such voting process. It's purely, and that's what we did with Staff's Jam, for example. We just went, these are the games people made. Here's the links to them. Go and have a look.
Fantastic. And I guess, and again, this might be something that as you're moving forward, you're looking at doing. You've said there about receiving the feedback. What other ways is there for game students or developers in general to sort of reflect on their process and reflect on what went well, or how to move it forward, and to encourage that sort of growth? The next one will be bigger and better, as you said, from a jam. It might not be it's the perfect game.
Sure. No, I mean, that's interesting. What you could have, and I know that, so again, there's no sort of right way to be involved in a games jam. People approach them very differently, and that's the beauty of them in a way. It's like, it's down to how they do it. But I know that a lot of people keep logs of what they do as they are doing them. So if they've got 4 days, they will perhaps record videos at the end of each day, just summarizing what they've done, and share that. That gives them something tangible to look back and reflect on. Like it could even be as simple as keeping a development log. It doesn't have to be a video, but just keeping some kind of process that you can look back on and be like, right, perhaps that day not enough got done, or perhaps that day I spent too long focused on this particular aspect. Maybe I could have parked it and developed this other area that ultimately turned out a bit weaker in the final product. We do have sort of group work at the university, and part of that is we ask students to document everything that they've been doing so that they can evidence to us what they've done. So I think perhaps if we were to host another games jam, perhaps we could encourage people to document that process as they're going.
Fantastic. I've got tons of questions, and I'd love to talk to you about this more afterwards as well. But because again, I'm in that hobbyist camp. But
awesome.
There's some questions from the chat here as well. Emma's asked, do you think it could work having a structure to invite ex-students to come back and take part in games jams if they wish, or even inviting anyone who has a portfolio to prove that they have the skills to take part? This could take place over summer to see what engagement we get outside of semesters.
Yeah, I love that idea. That's awesome. I mean, one of the things I want to look at is, yeah, and I haven't really touched on that on these slides. But is the actual organization of jams, not just the limitations that stop people getting involved, but if we were to organize a games jam, different places approach it very differently. I looked at Stafford College, for example, and when they organize games jams, they sort of have set times throughout the day that the staff have arranged for people to get together, talk. They actually schedule in breaks. Whereas when we did it, we just sort of said, go for it. You do this how you will. So there's probably like a lot for me to look at in regards to what is the perfect amount of organization that you can do for a games jam. So if that is perhaps sort of like tweaking the teams, us picking the team slightly and saying, let's get someone who's got some prior experience or someone from industry and put them with some, perhaps junior people, very much like the way that we run one of our big modules. We have a module where it's group work and we sort of put people together ourselves-ish. There could be an element of that, involved in it, as opposed to a completely hands-off. So yeah, that's awesome. That's really cool to think about.
And then the next question is, which barrier to engagement do you think is the most significant in deterring participation?
The most significant, I mean, I think all those four that I mentioned before are probably likely. I think perhaps one of the most frustrating might be there is someone who wants to get involved but can't. So, and that's going to tie in with like socioeconomic issues and whatnot. But there's things we can do to help with that. If we host them, like if we run them at uni and give people access, then they can get involved. So, if we're talking significance as in what is perhaps like the biggest one that is solvable, I don't have the resources. The other ones would be along the lines of that is changing perceptions. That is changing people's attitudes towards these things. And that, again, is a big piece of work. So I know that's a bit of that's a political answer, isn't it? Because I don't really answer that. But it's I take the question nonetheless. Like, I'll have a think about that.
Fantastic. And then there's another question here that says, perhaps the low consequences of games jams encourage participation. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, that's it. Yeah, and that's the beauty of it, isn't it? Like, there is nothing to lose. So that's why, I'm reticent to kind of, or hesitant to say, let's just stick some module credits and factor it into a degree. But, there's probably things, and tie it in with what Emma's said as well, like with the organization of them, if we schedule them in, say that these are opportunistic, these haven't got things attached, but if we can actually factor these in to someone's timetable early on, earlier on, and set their expectations that you're going to get involved, you should get involved in this for these reasons, and maybe that can push people towards it. But I absolutely take that. You've got nothing to lose, but because there's nothing to gain as such, that's the other side of that coin, isn't it? People don't get involved. So yeah, there's a lot to think about.
It's one of those eat your greens moments where it's because it's not assessed, but understanding why it is good for you and good for your development, and making that clear with students sometimes can be like a little bit of a challenge.
We need to be singing the praises of it, and people in industry who've done them should, if we can get those singing the praises of them as well. Gets involved in games jams when everyone else does. So maybe it's sort of like shining a light on that and be like, look, these people are where they are because they did this, not just their degree, not just their own experiences. They did it because they've got this passion to make these things. So
fab. And then let me just have a look. There's your favorite flavor of jam. I wasn't going to ask it, but I couldn't help myself.
Chris is my boss, so I've got to answer that. Marmalade. Marmalade. Is Nutella jam? If Nutella's jam, then Nutella.
I'm not sure.
There's another. I can do another talk on that. Is Nutella jam? Right. Okay. Fine.
Emma's also put in the chat, I feel like my point would also help students feel like there's other things to get involved with after they've graduated, which I know is a huge fear of finishing a degree and that nothing will follow it.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's an awesome point as well. Maybe there's more we need to do in sort of signposting people. So it's not just, we do a lot in the last year to prepare people for industry. The whole last year is spent preparing people for it, and we do a good job of it. But there will be people who don't go straight into industry. So I think maybe sort of like signposting these things, perhaps having, people don't have to come back and study with us, but as graduates, maybe they can come back and still do games jams, you know, and just get that experience still. There could be something there. I think that's an awesome idea.
Fabulous. And I'm just checking there's any other last questions coming in. And Sharon's mentioned they'd love the idea of a development log or reflection as part of the process.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
Fantastic. I'm just having a double check that I've asked you all the questions there. Thank you so much. I think that was really insightful, and I think there's plenty of conversations to continue around this. And obviously, as you've said, you're beginning your research then. I'd love to know how it goes afterwards. So
thanks very much.
Best of luck. Well done.
Yeah, thanks very much for the opportunity. Cheers. Thank you, everybody. I will hand you over to lovely Mr. Gittos, I believe.
So, thanks everyone for some really fantastic questions in the chat there as well, and to continue to do so during the presentations. So next up we have Jarrad, who I'm going to let introduce themselves and jump into their presentation.
Thanks, Stephanie. And bear with me. It's a tough act to follow. Just confirming that everyone can hear me, right?
Yes, I can hear you, and
Perfect,
the chat's saying yes as well.
Perfect, cool. All right, this was number 2 slide. Let me turn my camera on. There we go. So this was number 2, but obviously it'd be good to introduce myself first. So my name is Jarrad Gittos. I'm a lecturer in games design at Staffordshire University. I previously worked, obviously you can tell probably I'm not British. I'm Australian/British. So I previously worked at Curtin University in Australia for 15 years. And yeah, this is my very first conference presentation, really technically. So, you know, thanks for having me here. Appreciate it, Agatha, Sharon, and Stephanie for organising this event. I'm currently studying my master's, and I put in virtual production technologies, but I mean, that kind of encompasses a lot of different things. So we'll get into some of the minor details here. And yeah, so this is a picture of me at the top of a mountain in Canada in the Rocky Mountains, freezing my butt off, essentially. One of my first experiences of seeing snow, essentially. So I wasn't used to the cold then. I'm still kind of not used to the cold here, but I'm happy to be in the UK. And I've been here for 2 years. So yeah. What am I talking about today? Well, I'm talking about how we can explore low-cost solutions using microcontrollers and the benefits of doing that, and you know, what we can do with that in terms of connection and kind of interaction with virtual production. So at the moment, I'm not completely finished with my master's. I am entering the dissertation stage, so right at the end, and there's a lot of work to be done. So hopefully it's maybe a little bit interesting, at least, for those who are in chat right now. Before I go too deep with this, I think it's really important to talk about virtual production, and if we think it's the future of film. And you know, everyone's got their own opinions on this side of things. I'm kind of pro future of film. There's benefits to it, but I don't think that's ever going to replace traditional film in its current format. The benefit of virtual production is that it does blend traditional film methods, approaches, techniques with game engines. So the fidelity of game engines these days is getting you know, better and better. We're getting more realistic renders. We're getting more realistic props. We can put laser scanned and photogrammetry objects into a scene without with minimal impact on performance. So it's becoming more and more of a filmmaking tool, whether it be used for pre-production and planning, so pre-visualization, post-visualization, and even more so towards full in-camera visual effects. So we can see here, here's an image of Disney's The Mandalorian, which has primarily been shot on LED light stages. And there's pros and cons to that. So the benefit of using this kind of light stage is that you get accurate lighting on your foreground actors. The surrounding lights from the arc of the stage and also on the top mean that the reflections on materials match the environment. There's also a lot more flexibility when it comes to the environment. So traditionally in traditional films, you'd be getting a set, doing a full set production. You're maybe going to find lots of locations, scouting out locations, moving facilities around, and camera equipment and staff and actors and all this. And there's a lot of costs associated with that. The benefit of virtual production is that you can bring any fantasy environment, any location in the world, to a local studio without needing to go anywhere. So there's also a lot of flexibility in terms of the environment. So, for example, if you decide that you don't want a mountain on the left, you want it on the right in your environment, you can easily move that using the game engine. So that flexibility means that you can get more refinement in your environments, which is really cool. And obviously, there is a lot of speed addition to that. You can increase your shots. You can do more takes. You can do a lot of different things, right? So I think it's really important for a lot of people to be exploring the scope of virtual production and what you can do with it, and experimenting in this space. But there are problems with that, and the problems come down to accessibility of the technology. So let's have a look at the cost. We can look at the scale, and we can also look at the hardware attached. When you look at a production like The Mandalorian, a whole season costs roughly around $100 million to produce. And that obviously is not just the environment and the light stage, that it's the hardware costs, the computer costs, cabling, electricity, set production, staffing, obviously catering is probably in there as well. There's lots of different attachments to this cost, but the cost of higher end productions is quite high. And if you scale that back to smaller scale productions, maybe something that's not such a big kind of ticket item, even smaller scale productions such as like a 5x5 meter studio roughly sits around £500,000 for things to do with lights, cameras, hardware, wiring, computers to run the setup. So while you can get smaller scale productions going on, that is still very prohibitive for someone like an indie filmmaker or someone who wants to dabble in this space. It's not really viable in terms of an accessible technology to play with, right? And obviously attached to that, you've got lots of space requirements. You need to have high ceilings. You need to have a lot of space to be looking at this, heavy tech requirements. There's lots of different barriers to entry, essentially. So one of my questions in terms of my research for my master's is there scope to do something along the same lines, but on an indie level, I put it in quotes, indie, independent level, to increase accessibility to this new kind of emergent technology, which I do think will have an impact on filmmaking moving forward, given that we can now work with game engines, which in essence are free, right? These days you've got game engines that are available for free, and you can do some really amazing stuff with it. So I think that it has the potential to change the way that films are made for lots of smaller scale productions. However, we need to overcome that cost of entry. So there are a few people in this space that are already dabbling around, and it'd be a weird presentation if I didn't mention someone like Matt Workman. He's a cinematographer, and he's the cinematographer behind cinematographydb.com. And a lot of his early stuff was playing around with green screen spaces with HTC Vive controllers. So that's a VR location-based or a tracking solution for movement of objects in 3D. And obviously cameras, lenses, and game controllers, for example. So his early production tests were all to do with the positional tracking of cameras, the matching of camera settings with virtual cameras, and production values, obviously, with game engines. So you can see here, you got the top image of him with one of his expensive Canon cameras. I think it's a Canon. Feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. With a HTC Vive tracker on top. And below, he's also using this as a method of doing pure game engine camera work, right? So the virtual production side of things doesn't necessarily require video input. It can be done full engine as well, which is amazing, right? But even his attempts at lower cost solutions still were quite costly. So, for example, obviously game controllers are accessible. The cameras start getting quite pricey. The systems that you need to run this on are quite large and quite heavy. And he was using more kind of film related interfaces, such as inertia wheels, which can go upwards of $6,000 to pretty much use and buy and implement, right? So it's easy to say that a smaller scale indie production still can step up to the tens of thousands of either dollars or pounds to be able to play around with, right? So once again, I'm not flush with money. I don't have money just sitting there in a pile. I want lower cost solutions. So one of the things that I started looking at was microcontrollers as a means of creating your own custom controllers, making your own interfaces with the virtual environment. And we can see here are some prototypes that I've been playing around with, and I call it hacking with microcontrollers because there's a lot of processes involved in this. There's a bit of engineering, electrical engineering, product design, electronics, programming, game engine stuff as well, right? But one of the concepts was that we use the microcontrollers as a bridge between the physical and the virtual and back again as well, which is the most important thing. So that bridge essentially allows us to communicate with game engines through technology and receive outputs from game engines to drive things in the physical space as well. And the real thought process, I suppose, is if we can use microcontrollers and sensors, can these work simultaneously? So if I can input say like a potentiometer or a slider or something into the engine and change the camera property, can we also change the camera property on a physical camera at the same time? And in theory, that should work because the values are being gathered from the microcontroller and then distributed to different channels. And if we can simultaneously send it to those two channels, well, then we can operate everything in synchronization, because the key to all of this is to do with camera synchronization and light synchronization. That's how it works. If you look at those big production stages on Mandalorian, the camera is located in the virtual world and replicated in the physical world. The lights are casting from the virtual world to the physical world. Therefore, if we can solve those issues on a low-cost basis and we can make it scalable, there's a lot of different things that we can do. All right. So two-way communication is quite important. Being able to send inputs into the engine and also receive outputs from the engine. So we've been looking at a few things. We've looked at the Arduino Nano. You can see at the very top. And then we've also got the ESP32, which is a new addition to my research, where that offers a few more. I don't know. It's like a beefier car in essence. It's got more power under the engine. So it's kind of cool. So moving forward, I suppose I've got a few things here to show. The early stage production that I did showcase that I could create custom controllers for in-engine movement of camera, focus of camera, zoom of camera, aperture control, record control, all these different things. And lots of those controls could be done by really cheap components. So a joystick, for example, could cost, I don't know, 20p, 10p, right? Potentiometer, same thing. Buttons, really cheap, even lower than that. So there's a lot of kind of flexibility in terms of what we could do. And if I play this here, you can see here, I've got this little potentiometer that I turn, very subtle, but that is adjusting the focus of the camera, which is interesting because it's all done by Bluetooth. It's not connected by any cables, which is kind of cool. We can change things to do with the f-stop. You can see, obviously, we're going up in this one and then down, and then we can also record as well. So given that we can connect to the camera and it works pretty real time, we can also do that with the virtual environment. We can start creating some simple, low-cost solutions to interfacing both recording of the camera, physical camera, and also the virtual camera as well. And then the other video showcases a little bit of interaction to do with audio. With light. I heard audio, that's why I said audio. But there's a lot of kind of theory behind this. If you go back and look at virtual production stages, one of the reasons why they work so well is because the light that's being generated on the LED panels illuminates the actor to make them feel like they belong in the scene. The real question is, can we use environment inside of a game engine to drive lights in the real engine on a low-cost solution? And the answer is yes. I mean, I'm using these little kind of cables, these little cables of LEDs, RGB LEDs, and they are really cheap, right? So the early tests prove that we can communicate with the camera, and we can also receive and send information both ways in a real-time basis. So that comes to this. There's a lot going on the screen here. I understand that. But if we play this, we've got the top left, which is the in-game engine. We've got the right, which is a DMX patch out, which is essentially like it gathers the environment information and then sends out the light information to an external microcontroller. We have here is the in-camera shot, and here is the environment that's being filmed in. And just to make it a little bit easier to see what's going on, I've put it in a dark room just to obviously showcase what the effects are. And in theory, they should all be synced up simultaneously to work. So you can see here, we've got the camera being tracked, moving left and right. We have the light that's being moved around the physical space and also being tracked. And as you pull the light down and then you pull it up, it'll move dynamically in terms of like lighting the virtual scene and the physical scene. It's not perfectly matched up in this case, but it's pretty accurate. And I think that's going to be pushing forward the next kind of stage of research. So this whole approach for this master's covers a lot of different areas. It's quite often I get told that everything that I'm working on is too much. The scope is too big. And that's something that I suppose a lot of creatives end up being in that position. So I like to bite off more than I can chew, but the project's really interesting, really fun. I think there's got a lot of impacts in terms of accessibility for creatives to be playing with these technologies. It's a blend at the moment of product design, so a little bit of CAD work, 3D printing, prototyping processes, electrical engineering. Once again, it's to do with using electronics and circuitry and circuit boards, a bit of programming, game engine and game tech, as well as cinematography and production as well. The whole point of this, I suppose, is the interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary nature of this means that there's a lot of scope for experimenting to see if there's any other viable solutions, collaboration between different areas, user testing, all that type of stuff, right? So there's a few people out there right now in virtual spaces who are playing around with this. You've got Jake Water, who is an indie filmmaker in the US. We've got Aidan Wilson, who's an Unreal tech artist in Australia, who's in the virtual production space. And we've got always said this wrong, Ramiro Monte de Oca, who's a broadcast engineer in the US as well, just to name a few who are playing around with some of these technologies, the hybrid between virtual production, game engine stuff, and also cinematography and broadcast engineering. So this kind of virtual hack space and physical hack space can really push the boundaries of cinematography and help, I suppose, overcome some potential barriers in what we've got going on. So there's a lot to be done still, because obviously I'm still studying my master's and I'm still trying to push forward for this. One of the important kind of areas that I want to look at is things to do with ergonomics and usability. And you can see here, this is one of the really, really early prototypes of the system. It's made up of a whole bunch of random electronics. We've got buttons, we've got some LED light sensors as well. We've got some tertiometers in there, lots of different technology things. But what's really cool about this kind of hacky approach using microcontrollers to interface between the virtual and the physical is we can create our own custom solutions, no matter what you want to do. So for an example, if you prefer in terms of usability or an accessibility kind of reason to use something like a slider to slide something up and down over a radial kind of turn knob, well, you can do that. you can change that. You could use things to do with light sensors. If you want to put your hand over the light sensor and change the virtual world based on that, you can do that. You could even go even further and say, if I want to get environmental lights from outside and I want to use a light sensor outside, or maybe a humidity sensor to see if it's raining to drive the virtual space, we can do that as well. There's lots of different kind of things to do with virtual production that can cross into the real world. That's not just purely about, can I sync up lights and camera and do a production based on that at a low cost. It kind of gives us that immense amount of flexibility to what we want to do. So in terms of like what I'm focusing on, obviously cinematography and virtual production is the focus. So I want to make sure that the system is as usable to as many people as we can get, which means that we need to do some more 3D printing, do some more engineering, do some more kind of development and design of it, and just make sure it's as user-friendly as possible. But the kind of scope of it goes beyond this, I think. So it's kind of exciting, I think. And, you know, talking a bit more about accessibility of virtual production, as I mentioned at the very start, the cheaper the solutions we can get, the more participants we can have in this space. One of the barriers that I have is I'm trying to learn more about virtual production. I'm still very new to this space. However, I can't just walk into a virtual production studio and learn it. I have to what I'm doing now is almost making my own virtual production studio from electronics. So, you know, we need to try and find ways to make cheaper solutions, make easier accessible solutions, you know, allow for that indie or independent level of engagement, and also level engagements for universities, colleges, schools, and any filmmaker across the world with a lower budget. That's not to say that everything is cheap in this kind of scenario. We still do need good computers. We still do need decent cameras. We do need tracking solutions. However, it's not in the 500,000 range. It's more in the, you know, maybe 5,000 range where possible, maximum. So, for example, the virtual controller solution that I have currently cost roughly around £100 to prototype and implement. And the LED panel, I've actually got it right here. I'm not going to pull it over. Maybe you'll see it in the camera. Only costs around £50 to create. So, you know, the fact that we can start dabbling in these kind of technologies with free game engines means that we can encourage more universities, colleges, schools, filmmakers to be playing around with these kind of cool technologies. And just, I'm aware of time, we're kind of coming to the end a little bit. We can stretch that beyond. We can use those microcontrollers for anything. Here's just a whole mess of cables about an escape room, for example, which starts using some of these microcontrollers to do physical interactions. But what if we could use a hybrid between game engines, film, and electronics to create more immersive experiences that stretch beyond the screen, the desktop screen, or the big screen, to create more immersive experiences and that kind of crosses into, you know, human computer interfaces and accessibility related to that as well. So there's a lot of research that can be extracted from this, even simulations, training simulations, real world simulations. We're currently talking about some of those kind of potential extensions of that in our own kind of academic practice right now. So in terms of where I'm going further, this is obviously the final stage of the dissertation where I'm at right now. There's a lot of things that I want to work on. Here is me playing around with the early stages of the camera tracking and the digital kind of interface right now. But optimization and redesign of the handheld controllers, the mount for the camera, tracking solutions, optimize the code and some of the more kind of techie side of things, reducing jitter, and also essentially put it in the hands of cinematographers, put it in the hands of producers, put it in the hands of UE or you know, game engine artists and game techs. And ideally, I'd like to have a system where anyone can come along, pick it up and use it without much barriers to entry. So a lot of user testing will take place over the next couple of months, which will be interesting once I've redesigned a few things. But that's pretty much the end of the project. I think by exploring this space, there's a lot of scope that's within the virtual production to increase accessibility and even usability of the hardware. The cost is really prohibitive at the moment, so ideally I'd like to reduce that, and hopefully the final product will, I don't know, provide an alternative solution for those who are willing to explore hacky approaches to virtual production. So that's about it. Are there any questions?
Fabulous. So I'll kick off first. And it gives people, if they do have any questions, to pop them in the chat as well. I guess my first question, and it's just bringing it back to this idea of diverse voices, really, is, are virtual sets more accessible for cast and crew? If so, how? And if not, how could they be made more accessible?
I think they are more accessible because it removes the requirement to change locations. The locations can be changed on the fly. The narrative can be based around whatever you want it to be. It can be fantasy. It can be, physical. It can be real life. That means that anyone that wants to create anything from any cultural background, any kind of context, any location, any set, can still do that from their own kind of internal studio. So it gives that kind of freedom and flexibility to pretty much give more power to, those the creatives in essence.
And my second question would a little bit around the idea of impact on environment as well, because something that came to mind as you were talking through the presentation was the backlash that Mad Max Fury Road happened to get after the film was made because of the massive environmental impact it had. And you think, well, because we can create things within these virtual productions, I'm wondering if you could speak to the sort of the offset of, obviously this is using a lot of electricity versus going into these real life locations and the potential environmental factors there.
Well, I mean, it depends on how you look at this, right? So you could say that there's a lot of electricity attached to virtual production, but there's also a lot of use of things like fossil fuels to go to locations, to transport things, to a lot of sets in environments can be harmful to the environment. So if you want to go down that path, it's like, what's the better choice? Is it better to try and just use a bit of electricity, and maybe you could use green electricity to run the virtual production stages, which, I mean, the fidelity and the realism of game engines and simulations and smoke and cloth and all that type of stuff is getting so accurate that you could probably fool a lot of people by just doing it virtually in real time, right? So is there a need to go to these different locations, to ship a whole bunch of people there, to destroy the environment, to use the fossil fuels to get there? Or is it better to do it in a virtual situation? So, I mean, I'll leave it open as a statement. I'm not an expert in this area. I think it's just important to have both sides of the argument, I think.
Fantastic. And then, sorry to ask something a little off topic there, but just something again.
No, that's a good question.
Personal interest a little bit there as well.
Yeah.
So there's a question here from David asking, are there any tensions between the indie virtual production space and how these technologies are being adopted by large companies like Disney?
Well, I think the tension is that the indie space doesn't really have the means to interact with it too much. At the moment, even if you're doing green screen, early kind of indie level virtual production, the barrier is actually the lighting of things. So if the lights don't match on a green screen, it instantly doesn't look realistic. And as such, you need to do post-processing, but then there's no point doing live virtual production or in-camera virtual production because you're already layering that kind of extra layer of process on it. So in terms of the tension, I don't see any tension yet because there's no parity in that. You know what I mean? There's not enough indie level solutions yet. But in saying that, there are companies that are picking up on that right now. So, for example, HTC Vive are releasing brand new, I think it's I can't remember the name of the Mars or something. It's a low-cost overall solution for indie developers, roughly priced at $5,000 US. That's going to increase the capability of indie level to do that. So that'll be interesting to see as it evolves over time.
Fantastic. So, apologies that there's always a little delay between me turning it back on and speaking. It's because I'm having to turn the volume down there. I'm just checking if there's any last questions. If anyone would, and this goes throughout the entire panel, if anyone would like to turn their microphone on and ask a question directly, you can do so.
Clap.
There's some little claps and lots of thanks.
I'll take
in the
it.
chat
I'll
as well
take it.
there. So I'll take the opportunity to say thank you very much for the presentation. There are lots of really interesting things within there.
Thanks, Stephanie. Appreciate it.
No problem. So then last but not least, we have the presentation from Chris. If Chris would like to come on and introduce yourself and then begin your presentation.
You are allowed to say last and least. That's absolutely fine. My colleagues have certainly put me to shame today. Hi, my name's Chris Headleand. I'm just, as a pre-warning, I'm on a tiny little laptop in the middle of nowhere. So I'm not going to be able to see my presentation, sorry, see the chat and things as I'm talking through because I've only got the one screen. So if at any point you want me to clarify something, feel free to join on audio, mute yourself, and let me know. So I'm just going to share. So hopefully everyone can see that. So my talk today is about building virtual worlds to understand student campus experience. So first, a little bit about me. My name's Chris Headleand. I'm the head of the Games Development Department. I have a degree in design and education, so I come from a very traditional kind of product design background. My MSc and PhD are both in computer science. My research is in games, VR, inclusion and education. I'm a National Teaching Fellow, Advanced HE National Teaching Fellow. And if by all means you want to create a connection with me, you can find me on Twitter or drop me an email. I have quite an eclectic background, but there's some kind of themes that kind of run through my career history, and those around inclusion, transition, and student engagement. So you might have heard this thing called the metaverse. Now, the metaverse is a broad collection of technologies. It's really descriptive of a paradigm shift in how we interact with technology. Broadly speaking, we might refer to this as virtual worlds, spaces where people kind of live second lives, so they can live virtually through different experiences. It's not monopolized by one company. There's a lot of discussion about the metaverse, that one particular company is capitalizing on that. And it's certainly not as new as people think. A lot of people here might play games such as EVE Online, or anybody who's been in higher education for a while probably has nightmares remembering of simulations like Second Life. And if you have, as we've been talking about film quite a lot today, there's this theme. You might be aware of a film called Ready Player One. The entire idea behind this is a metaverse, the idea that you can live a entirely second life in a virtual space. So what could that potentially mean for a university? Sorry, I have terrible hay fever and it gives me a nasty cough. One thing that we found when we started the pandemic was the students were missing the campus experience. A university is not its buildings. You can take the buildings away from a university and the university would still exist for its people. But we would be wrong to say that the campus and that campus experience isn't part of that university experience. Certainly most universities have a place where students go to take their photo on graduation or to share a picture of their holding their thesis up before they submit. There are nuances and embedded knowledge that exists in that space. So one of the things that we did at my previous institution, Lincoln, when we went online, we explored actually trying to recreate the campus experience through a metaspace, through a metaverse. We called this Lincoln Island. Now, Lincoln Island was a recreation, reimagining of the University of Lincoln campus through an online metagame. Just quickly, there are a number of problems with. I've put virtual reality. There should really be virtual activities. When we went online, when we hit the lockdown, virtual activities became commonplace unless it changed the way that students interacted with campus. Things like offer days, open days, community engagement, these kind of broader open campus events transitioned online. And this is all well and good, but you lose a lot of the serendipity around the campus. So things like, bumping into somebody on a corridor, you lose that kind of engagement. You lose a sense of space, a sense of physicality, which can be quite important. Now, transitioning into university can already be a really challenging time for new students. Alternative options, video calls, and kind of virtual events, streamed events, didn't provide that sense of place that a campus tour can provide. And again, especially when you're dealing with students who this may be their first time away from home, or even, for international students, maybe their first time in this country, not being able to actually understand the space and kind of transition into that area became really challenging. So what was Lincoln Island? It was a virtual reimagining of the Lincoln campus. We reimagined it as a Pirate Island video game, built to what we call absolute ZX scaling. So the campus was the virtual campus was one-to-one scaled with the real campus. So buildings were exactly the same shape, they were exactly the same size. So if you learned to navigate this space virtually, you would know how to navigate the physical space. 50 staff, 108 students immortalized as in-game AI characters. So you can walk around Lincoln Island and you can interact with, I think the virtual Chris still roams there, despite the fact that I'm long since gone. And they have their own little brains, and they will tell you their favorite spaces, and they'll give you bits of sage advice. It was developed by myself and a couple of research students with no budget in 3 weeks during my paternity leave. It was absolutely full of bugs, shortcuts and corners. And one thing I always say is it was built during the sleep deprivation of a first-time parent. It was a fairly limited game. However, with all that considered, it still had over 8,000 downloads and had a significant impact on things like recruitment and transition during the pandemic. And this is what it looks like. You could walk around, if you've ever been to the Lincoln campus, the Brayford Pool campus, this is what it looks like. This is the business school that we're walking towards now. And one of the things that kind of makes Lincoln relatively unique is that the entire campus is bisected by a train line. And actually getting the level crossings right becomes a significant part of the student experience. The other reason that we kind of lent into this Pirate Island idea was University of Lincoln campus is built on the banks of a lake, and there's a marina there, so that marina lent itself really nicely into becoming a pirate port. But this building we're going to pass now, this is what we call the Minerva building. This is the kind of main academic centre. MHT is directly ahead. But we also use this space for doing kind of occasional events. We set up fairs and art shows and things like that. So one thing I'm always asked is why reimagine and why not make this photorealistic campus? And my usual answer is real life is boring, but pirates are cool. There's no need to get bogged down with detail when extracting the experience of a university. I said, if we're going to absolutely model, what about this, where we keep the bins? What about where the boilers are? Nobody cares about that level of minutiae and detail. There's also access issues. We want to keep this as lightweight as possible. Ideally wanted students to be able to play it on a phone or really low weight device. Photoreal is really computationally expensive, so we didn't see the advantage in that route. It was fun, and it put creativity as the focus. This thing here where I say toilet doors comes down to this idea that, you know, if you put something, you know, in a space where people want to be there, people have other reasons to be there. Like putting the poster on the back of a toilet door, you've got more chance that somebody's going to read that than out in a corridor, because somebody's going to be sat down and they'll be looking for something to read. What we wanted to do is embed information into a game that was fun to play, and that would inherently provide a vehicle to delivering additional information. Again, we also allowed us to abstract the university without having to visualize the surroundings. I had no interest in building the entirety of the city of Lincoln, and actually being able to effectively take a pair of virtual scissors, cut around the campus and ignore the rest, to make it into an island was really useful as a narrative device. But as a piece of research, what this allowed us to do was engage students in the design of a campus and actually get some really interesting kind of practice-led information about how students value the campus, what they value in a campus, and specifically what is important to the students, and what makes the campus their campus, and what is their campus. I think sometimes we think students are more broadly attached to a university than sometimes they are. For many students, their university is their immediate lecturers, their immediate lecture spaces. And actually capturing that information was really important. One of the ways that we did this, so I mentioned we had AI called NPCs, non-player characters that walked around the campus. We gave a whole bunch of students and alumni a form to fill out, which was, what are your favorite places? What routes do you take between these buildings, between these two buildings on campus? What advice would you give to students if they bumped into you today? And through this, we kind of created these virtual behavior patterns. And actually seeing how those virtual characters behave gave some really interesting insights. But we also had this corpus of data about what made Lincoln Lincoln, and actually what the themes that came out through that data gathering of allowing students to design this reimagining really highlighted the things that the students valued above everything else. And they weren't necessarily what we would have expected. I mentioned earlier, I put here over 150, but the number was closer to 280. Students and alumni engaged in that process. And now student opinion is baked into Lincoln Island, and it acts as an artifact of, you know, what we call the Lincoln ethos. But the other thing that we did to do this was use social media. So as we were designing the environment, we were putting regular, we call them whips, or work in progress. We'd put our latest bits of art or building designs, we'd stick those on social media, and we'd get opinions, and we'd get quite a lot of opinions from current and former staff, current students and alumni about what we really should be focusing on. And this is how we built the space. So this is the University of Lincoln, having cut around it with those kind of virtual scissors. It's an interesting campus because it's bisected in two directions. There's a major A road that cuts the campus from east to west. You can kind of see that in the middle. And I don't know why I just pointed at the screen. You can't see me point. And a train line that bisects it north to south. So we took an aerial photo with height data and copied the bits that we're interested in. This created our island. We then simplified that, convert the image to a data vector, including placeholders for important buildings, things that we knew we needed to recreate absolutely. And then over time, we turned that into a more stylized map. And it's actually one of the largest game worlds I've ever created as a single space. And we created it in about 3 weeks. It's also the fastest I've ever gone from design to production of a video game. Hence why it's full of holes and problems. So that's my talk. I mentioned the train. The train is a significant element of the Lincoln experience, and we do actually have a train that goes around. One of the things that we baked into that was our things. People like our external examiners, honorary professors, things like that. They exist on the train, so you can meet some of those people. Yeah. Any questions?
The first question I wanted to ask, but the chat has made me think that it is in the works anyway, is what's next? When do we get Staffordshire University Island?
So the staff's verse is something that we're looking at in the games development department at the moment. We're in this really unique position at staffs where we're one of the very few universities where we have games artists, technical designers, programmers, all in a single department. I think we're one of the few university, games departments in the UK that could actually bring together a AAA game. So we're currently looking at design of what we can do with the Staffsverse. This was built by myself and a couple of students over 3 weeks. So we're looking at spending a little bit longer than that and a few more people, and certainly people more talented than I, to put together something a bit more special.
Fantastic. And then just having a look at the chat here. So David's asked for the staff's version, just to follow on from that, do you imagine us having both halves of the campus? And if so, how are you going to join them? What about the area of private accommodation, the terrace houses and the main roads that split up the campus?
So this was the really interesting thing about Lincoln Island, at the point where it became kind of like action and practice-led research rather than just an exercise in building a video game. All these things are open to discussion and interpretation. As you're reimagining, actually, you need to ask yourself: is that something that the student is that central to the student experience, or is that something you can abstract away from? If the fact that, for me, my personal kind of Staffordshire experience, I move between the two halves of the campus quite often. I mean, walking through the art building as my tunnel from my office down towards Catalyst, and that's a significant part of my university experience. But that might not be how the students relate to it. And understanding that and understanding that value. Now, if those terrace houses are something that the students will remember when they leave here, will they remember that walk? Then you can bake that in and you can reimagine and recreate that in a certain way. If it isn't, then it doesn't really matter. You can get rid of it because it's a video game. We can do what we want.
And do you think this is, and I will get to some of the questions there as well, and do you think this could be used to give a sort of sense of belonging for the spaces? Like you said before, students even arrive within here, they're having these, even though they are virtual AI connections with these students and staff that are on there.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things I noted, and the point that I realised it was when I was speaking to the last kind of inducted cohort of students. My virtual Chris that exists in Lincoln Island has his dog walks around with him, and that's how I've personified myself in that space. My dog is a major part of my persona. My personality is my dog. I need to probably revisit that one with a therapist at some point, but. And what was really interesting was that students would be asking me about my dog, and I was like, I've not told you I have a dog. And it took a while to kind of realize that they already felt like they had a connection with me. They already felt that they knew me, and because they did interact with me in this space. But the most interesting thing to note was the advice that they'd got from the other virtual students, how to navigate from space to space. That they felt a little bit more confident moving around the campus because, university campuses are big and scary, right? And it demystified a little bit for them because they'd already been there virtually, but they had visited and they had walked around.
And Elliot's commented in the chat asking if scanning could be used to capture real data of class interiors, corridors, and then be 3D modelled over with the sort of flat/pirate style. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, there's 101 ways that you can, there's many ways to skin a cat and there's many ways to build a model, right? It's I think everything comes down to kind of time investment. One of the things that we benefit with from as a university, and I think all universities in the UK of this, is we have quite dedicated estates departments. So things like blueprints, floor plans are usually quite easy to get. So yeah, you can capture those details through any number of means. But from our general, any kind of building that's been built since kind of the 1900s, you should be able to get a floor plan and extrapolate a building from that. Where those techniques come in really useful, and I was in a call with somebody about a piece of research recently on much older buildings which have been modified significantly since their floor plan, and that data doesn't exist in any kind of digital form, and actually scanning that and doing things like comparing the actual floor plan. Because the other thing is, even when there were floor plans, people might be somewhat creative with how they were interpreted. And actually being able to do that comparison data is really useful. So potentially not for this project, but other projects, absolutely.
And then there's a question there from Sharon saying, also maybe for students who are distance learning, the idea of community and interaction is always a problem with that student experience.
Sorry, you cut out for half a second there.
Hold on 1 second. I think it's because the audio is looping back through my laptop. So Sharon put, also maybe for students who are distance learning, the idea of community and interaction is always a problem with that student experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's something that we see quite common over multi-campus universities is how connected people feel to the core campus or the core kind of university, and a lot of universities, I think something like 1 in 3 major universities now have some sort of international campus somewhere, right? And you know, if you're in the University of trying to think of a place that doesn't exist, Basingstoke. You're at Basingstoke University, right? And you have a Malaysian campus. How connected to Basingstoke do your Malaysian students feel? And actually being able to give them that kind of virtual link and actually say, no, actually you are part of this community, but also going the other way and actually allowing your Basingstoke students to visit your Malaysian campus virtually. It's not something we've experimented with yet, but I can see that having impact. And again, in Stoke, we have various campuses. And again, how do our London students feel connected to Stoke? How do our Stoke students feel connected to London? And you know, the other campuses that we have around as well. And actually making sure that these things are reflected and that diversity is represented, I think is really valuable. It'd be interesting to see. And with distance learners, actually, can you then give them a sense of space, and sense of place, despite being remotely engaged?
And then there's a final comment from Emma here that says that that this is a fantastic idea. I feel this links to accessibility in its finest form, especially after the pandemic. This concept moves forward what we've learned and how we can inform and engage visitors, students and academics, whilst informing them on avoiding a daunting prospect of getting lost.
Yeah, and you know, I suppose there's a balance, right? Because you don't want to... I always think chaos breeds memories, right? And there's lots of stuff I don't remember from university, but I absolutely remember accidentally going to a lecture for, I think it was second year dance and movement or something like that, and sitting down in this lecture thinking it was going to be design, and then having to sit through 3 hours of really quite interesting content that I had nothing. I will remember that, and I'll tell my kids that story one day, right? There's a lot of value in getting lost, but there's also it's structuring that with a little bit of confidence. So actually, you know, okay, so I'm lost, I've attended the wrong thing, but I know how to address that, and I have this, you know, it eases transition, but it doesn't replace transition.
I like how far you got into that dance class. You just accepted that you were in the wrong class and said, "I'm learning something new today."
I was too embarrassed to leave, if I'm honest. I sat there and I was such a keen bean as a student. I was sat right in the middle. So there was getting up would have meant moving a whole bunch of theatre folk out the way, and that wasn't going to happen.
Fantastic. And I think I've covered all the questions there. I just want to invite people, if they do want to put their microphone on and ask any questions, then please feel free to do so. And again, there's lots of, because a lot of these projects that have been presented in this panel are ongoing, there's lots of external conversations that I think are to be had that are really interesting, and have got lots of scope for collaboration as well with one another, which is really great to hear. And it's been really great to have all three of you present. The little bit of, unless there's any last point, sorry, Chris.
No, I was just going to say thank you for hosting.
Sorry, what was that?
I was just going to say thank you for hosting.
Oh, no problem at all. What I will do is let everyone know where we're going and what's happening next. So there's another panel starting at 4 o'clock. There's the two panels. So we've got dissemination and expression, and we've got filmmakers' insights as well. So there's a half an hour gap between them. And just as always, you can choose which panels you would like to attend. We've said it before, but I'll say it again here. If you're split and you want to go to both because they're both really fabulous, all the panels have been recorded. Over the next few weeks after we've concluded the conference and festival, we're going to be editing them and putting them up and live on our YouTube, so you can share those. You can share those widely afterwards, and they'll be released on a week-by-week basis. So if you do miss one, don't feel like you have to keep running between both of the panels. Thank you so much to our panelists, and thank you for everybody who's contributed in the chat and the audience as well. So we will see you in either panel at 4 o'clock. Thank you very much, everyone.